There's a stain on my garment, dear Aisha, dear Aisha. There's a stain on my garment, dear Aisha, a stain. Tell me how did it get there, Muhammad, Muhammad? Tell me how did it get there, Muhammad? Tell me. Sexy slave girls, dear Aisha, dear Aisha, dear Aisha. Sexy slave girls, dear Aisha. I just lost control. There's Maria Al-Qubtiya, Rayana bin Sayed, Ayman, and others. You know I can't wait. But Bilal's calling Adhan, Muhammad, Muhammad. Now it's time for the salat, Muhammad, it's time. Then scrape it, dear Aisha, dear Aisha, dear Aisha. Then scrape it, dear Aisha, dear Aisha, scrape it. Sahih Muslim 572-3377, Surah 66, Al-Bukhari 232, Surah 424.
Allah is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god. And Muhammad is not a prophet. Muhammad is not a prophet. If you want grace and mercy and love, Islam is not for you. But Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is the King of Kings who died to save us all. If you just repent and believe He took your sins on the cross, then mercy and grace, forgiveness and love, eternity can be yours. But Allah is a false god, a false god, a false god. Allah is a false god, a false god.
Hallelujah. Let Lord Jesus Christ shine forth. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us. Welcome to another live stream with DCCI Ministries. And tonight in Britain, everyone is blessed to have Dr. Robert Spencer with us. Peace of Christ be with you, brother.
And with you, thank you.
How are you doing?
It's my honor to be here to speak to you, and it is a great joy as well. And thank you very much.
Actually, it is a privilege for us to have you. It's not only you are author of the Quran, but also I understood that you published your 22nd book as well. So
26.
you are man, 26, I'm sorry. You are man with lots of skills and lots of wisdoms. And I also understand you are banned from UK.
Yes, that's correct. So until you emigrate, there's no chance that I can meet you. The government there said that it would be a threat to the public order were I to enter, which means, of course, not that I would do anything, because I've never advocated violence, committed any violence, condoned any violence, but the Muslims would riot in the UK, apparently, or the government is afraid they would, so I cannot go in.
Yeah, they are able to get away with lots of things these days. So
Indeed.
well, it's the loss of UK, but good thing is God provide internet for us, so you can travel to UK virtually. So thank you very much for being with us. So those of you who are joining us in the chat, we will be talking about one of the most misunderstood words in the world, which is called jihad, and kind of going through history of it little bit. If any of you want to get our attention or bring up your questions, please put @ in front of DCCI, and that should be all, or get our attention, and we'll be fine from this side. So just a second. Okay, so before I kind of pass on to you, Robert, What is your 26th book about?
Who Lost
That's a lot
Afghanistan?
of book.
It's called Who Lost Afghanistan, and it's about the American military misadventure in Afghanistan for the last 20 years and how it was mishandled from the beginning, wrongly conceived, wrongly executed, and wrongly ended. And the whole thing was a mistake because of the American government's unwillingness or inability to face the reality of Islam and jihad. That is the reason for the failure in Afghanistan. But even today, this is not known, and that's what the book explains.
Okay. Is the book available in Amazon? I
Yes,
haven't got it yet.
it is
It's
available.
okay. Also, we will put the link in the description as well. If you are curious about why Afghanistan is lost and who lost, please get the book, read it, and it will enlighten you. What is your first book about?
The first book?
Do you remember?
Oh, that's 100 years ago. Let's see. The first book actually, seriously, was right after 9/11. I was asked to write a book because I was working for, well, I don't want to make the story overlong. There was a book that had been commissioned by a publishing house, and it was full of mistakes. For example, the author said Muhammad would have been appalled and angry by 9/11. And so they sent this to me to check it, and I said, no, this is false. It's Muhammad would have loved 9/11. It was exactly the sort of thing that he would have wanted to do himself. And at length, they dropped that book and asked me to write one in its place very quickly, and that was called Islam Unveiled, and that came out back in 2002.
So within 20 years, you wrote 26 books.
Yes.
That's a lot of book. Well,
It's
thank you for writing them, and thank you for clarifying all those misunderstanding of the society as well as Islam. So probably it crushed the heart of Muhammad as he ordered people to practice 9/11.
I thank you. You're very kind. Islam
Okay.
Unveiled is, I think, well, of course, Islam hasn't changed. There's a great deal that has changed in the world since I wrote that book. But the information about Islam, of course, that's always the same.
Yeah, yeah. It is still the religion of pieces.
Yes.
So I hear this word jihad, and recently I saw some advertisements where singleness in Islam was jihad. There is place in British Museum. There is a room given to Islam, actually two rooms, and kind of there are a couple of sorts, but they are just for people to see it, and it talks about how Islam peacefully able to conquer the world. They didn't say like roses and chocolates, but they expressed that it was peaceful, and even how South Asia welcomed Islam. Versus, I look at Islamic sources and I come across this word jihad. It doesn't look that peaceful or about love or singleness. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, jihad, of course, means struggle, and struggle has all kinds of connotations, just as the word struggle in English has all kinds of meanings. But the primary meaning of jihad in the Quran and in the life of Muhammad is warfare against unbelievers in order to impose Islamic law over them. That's the thank you from Kaduna. There's a lot of jihad in Kaduna, and it is quite violent in Kaduna because of the teachings of the Quran. It's interesting to note that nowadays in the British Museum, as you say, and elsewhere, it is routinely taught that the primary meaning of jihad is a spiritual struggle within the soul of the believer to conform his life to the will of Allah. But that doesn't even appear in the Quran. And the Quran is taken for granted that jihad means warfare. And if you don't believe me on that, then check chapter 8, verse 41, just as one example of many I could give. that says you should give the fifth of what you take in jihad to the Prophet. And
I know
so,
Prophet was very poor guy. He always needed money.
yes, but
His
you
job was
see,
harder.
if jihad is prayer and fasting and struggle in that sense, then there's no fifth of it to give. I can't give a fifth of my prayer to Muhammad. I can't give a fifth of my spiritual struggle to better myself and avoid sin to Muhammad. And so it's ridiculous to think that it's anything but warfare and taking the possessions of the people that you have killed and enslaved.
But we are not in a war with Islam or with the world, or Islam is not in a war with the world. Therefore, those verses was just for that time, and it is not for us today. I am sure you heard of that.
I hear that every day for 25 years,
Answer.
30 years now. This is, in the first place, of course, as you know, it's something that is belied by the actions of Muslims nowadays in waging jihad. Obviously, if jihad is something that was only for that time and not for our own time, a lot of Muslims don't understand it properly. That's right, the Godfather. But if it was warfare in the sense of extending Islam, we have a great many authorities who tell us that that is the proper understanding. All the way through the history of Islam, you find Islamic scholars, clerics, and political leaders as well saying that jihad is primarily warfare against unbelievers. The earliest authorities also, for example, Ibn Hisham, working from the Sirah Rasulullah of Ibn Ishaq, the first biography of Muhammad in the 8th century or the early 9th century, they say that the Quran has 3 stages in its teaching on jihad. The first is tolerance, the second is defensive warfare, and the third is offensive warfare for spreading the religion. And so if offensive warfare is the third and final stage, then it obviously is something that is not only for one time. The history of Islam bears this out because Muslims have acted this way all through history, and consequently, there's just no way to maintain the idea that this was only for that time and no longer to be applied. It's not borne out by the text, not borne out by the interpreters, and not borne out by the history. All 3 of those point to the idea that the teachings of the Quran regarding jihad are applicable for all time, in all places, for all people.
It just kind of gently forces me to bring what Ottomans did to Armenians, but I am Turkish and I know a little bit your background. I am not sure if that conversation will go good.
Where are you from?
I'm from Istanbul.
Oh, really? Oh, well, my family's from Chesme.
Okay, yeah, so we kicked you out?
Yeah, they were kicked out around the time of World War One. They were offered the conversion to Islam and respectfully declined, and thus were offered to leave the country, which was, of course, they must have been dealing with moderates, or they would have been killed. Only one of my family members was killed, my great-grandfather, on the way out by a soldier who thought he had some gold. But the rest of them got out, or I wouldn't be here talking to you. So we were almost neighbors.
What is the reason that Ottoman Empire used to be like this great empire, and I don't want to kind of make you feel bad, but we learned that in our history. We went to other lands to share life with them. We teach them our customs, and we were mainly welcomed. So as we were sharing life, and then of course in the First World War, we did have enemies in our borders, and all we wanted to do is just like take our lands to our hands. What is the reality of that?
The reality is that in the heyday of the empire, when the empire was at its height, the Jews and Christians were subjugated as zimmis under the rule of Islamic law, were forced to endure various humiliations and discrimination in order to emphasize to them every day that they were enemies of Allah and needed to repent and accept Muhammad and the Quran, and were subject to various deprivations as a result. The fall of the empire at the time of World War I and what happened to my own family, the empire was falling because, for one reason, because the minority people that this light had been brought to, as you say, they did not think very highly of it. They didn't want to live under the rule of the Ottoman Sultan, and consequently, they were trying to establish independent states. And of course, Greece was able to gain its independence in 1821. The Armenians wanted their independence. Many of the Greeks, including the people in my own family, they wanted to, the Greeks in Western Anatolia, in what is now Western Turkey, they wanted to join with independent Greece. This would have been the end of the Ottoman Empire. And so the Ottoman Empire considered them to be Kufar Harbi, infidels at war with Islam, because they were rebelling against what they considered to be the just authority of the Ottoman Sultan, the authority that Allah had put in place. And so their lives were forfeit. And they were killed, 2.5 million Armenians, 1 million Greeks, 300,000 Assyrians, all were killed because they were Christians who were considered to be at war with Islam for not wanting to accept the rule of the empire, or just being assumed that they were in sympathy with the rebels. For example, the ecumenical patriarch Gregory V in Constantinople was murdered on Easter Sunday by the, or was it Palm Sunday? I'm sorry, I've forgotten. But he was assumed to be in sympathy with the Greek independence movement, even though he had actually denounced it as a good dhimmi. And so he was murdered and hanged. They hung his body outside the doorway of the ecumenical patriarchate as a warning to the Christians, and it hung there for several days. This was all designed to strike terror in the enemies of Allah, as per the Quran.
So you express that numbers of people, millions of people were killed. There were some of the books after I moved to UK, the books I didn't read when I was in Turkey. Like those killings are not that gentle, like someone is just like shooting you. Women's, like they cut their tummy, pregnant woman, they took the baby out, they killed the baby. Like it's like horrible, horrible death. What are your thoughts on? I can't talk about much about it because like I'm Turkish and it puts people in trouble. What are your thoughts on as this genocide was happening? Actually, it has nothing to do with Islam in a sense. 1900s are way, way far from time of Muhammad, and everything has been misunderstood. Everything, people are not following the Islamic scripture. You use the term dhimmi in British Library, in this like amazing room of Islam. There is a kind of artifact talks about dhimmi and focus on Egypt. It gives the impression that actually being dhimmi is a good thing. You are being protected. And British Museum is not ashamed of putting it up, even though I kind of wrote a couple of email to them. It is still there and they haven't done anything about it. So what are your thoughts on by 1900s, Ottomans walked away from Islam. it has nothing. What happened to Armenians? That genocide has nothing to do with Islam.
There are a couple of considerations. One is that their understanding is supported by the fact that the Ottoman Empire fell right around this time, and the Turkish secular state was established. And so people say, if the Turkish secularists continued the genocide, then how can you say it has anything to do with Islam? And there's a certain amount of truth to that, because the Turkish nationalists, in some ways, were quite hostile to Islam. They never persecuted Islam, but they were not happy with it. Kemal Ataturk himself said that Islam was the dead theology of an immoral Bedouin. He was not a pious Muslim. But the Turkish nationalist agenda was to create a secular Turkish state with a nominal Islamic identity that was shorn of political Islam. Consequently, they wanted to expel or convert the Christians who were in Turkey and make the state into a Muslim state that was not based on Islamic law. Their program in this coincided 100% with that of the Ottomans that they were supplanting, because the Ottomans were working on the basis of the theology I explained before. The idea that the Ottoman state had strayed a great distance from Islam and had forgotten Islamic principles is contradicted by the fact that Ottoman clerics explicitly justified the genocide of the Greek, Armenian, and Assyrian Christians at this time by invoking Islamic texts and teachings. And they would bring the Christians to Islamic clerics who performed the prayers for the slaughter of sheep over them when they were killing them. And so this was not only something that was in accord with Islamic teaching, but it was explicitly and expressly tied to Islam by the people who were doing it. But this history has been completely obscured. And what you experienced in the British Museum is sadly representative of a much more comprehensive universal phenomenon that Islamic groups in the West have very skillfully manipulated the ignorance of history that generally prevails in the West, and seized the opportunity to portray Islamic history as being entirely benign and having nothing to do with the various atrocities that Muslims obviously committed in the name of Islam and jihad.
I don't know if it has changed now, but like in my days, that was the general history we learned. And as I said, like I kind of read, what was the book called? Genocide. Last year I read a book on genocide of Armenians. That was like first time I have heard the alternative ways of that history. Can you unpack the term of dhimmi for us? Like, what is wrong with Christians? Why don't we want to be dhimmi? Why don't we want to be under the protection of Islam? It's at the end, it's not a gang. Gangs have like little bit dignity. But what is wrong being dhimmi?
Well, this is very important because the word means protected people, and so it sounds benign. And once again, this is a very skillful operation that Muslims have carried out throughout history, that they always portray what they do, no matter how bloody, no matter how oppressive, no matter how vicious and violent, they always portray it as something benign. And Westerners nowadays who don't know any history, they fall for it. So the British Museum says protected people, they're under the protection of the Muslims, and so the Muslims make sure that nobody bothers them.
Yeah, they're protected. It's like a gang, but like little bit.
Yes.
I believe gangs have dignity in reality, but the way it has been represented in Islamic history story. It's like something very positive, very romanticized version of it.
But you put up earlier, somebody said The Godfather, and this is very true,
Yeah.
because what the mafia would do in New York and other cities where it was operating in its heyday would be to go into stores and say, you pay us protection money and we will make sure nothing happens to you. Meanwhile, they were working hand in glove with the criminals. And so they would, if somebody had a store and they wouldn't pay the protection, then they would send in the people to break the windows. And so the protection you were paying was to the very people who would destroy your store if you didn't pay it. So it wasn't really protection at all. It was a kind of extortion. And this the same thing with the dimitude, that the non-Muslims would pay the Muslims for the Muslims not to kill them. And if the Muslims decided to kill them, they would do so anyway. And then what were the other ones going to do? They were forbidden to complain about their plight on pain of being killed themselves. And so nobody said anything. And even today, populations that have historically been dhimmis, they don't say anything, especially Christian Arabs. You find that they say, oh no, it was wonderful. Life in Syria, life in Iraq, life in Afghanistan, it was beautiful. The Muslims were wonderful and peaceful and tolerant to us, because they know they've been bred for generations, over centuries. They have to say all these things, because if they don't say it, it gets even worse.
So being dhimmi is not a good thing.
Not a good thing.
Paying jizya is not a good thing. Would you agree with me to say, like, even today's mafia has more dignity than Islamic understanding of dhimmi?
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting, the mafia analogy, because the Muslims occupied Sicily for several hundred years, and that's where the mafia developed. And it may be that there was a connection, because
they give birth to mafia.
Yeah, you have the code of silence, that you can't say anything about what happens. You have the payment of protection, and there are various other things that are similar to Islamic law that the mafia applies in a different context. And so the jizya is, you're paying a tax for the privilege of being able to live. And if you don't pay it, then your life is forfeit. You're to be killed. So this is really an organized kind of thuggery. It's not protection at all. It's just a criminal syndicate that is oppressing you.
So you helped us to think the historical way of what happened under the Ottomans to people who were not Muslim. And you give us the definition of dhimmi, as well as with the definition of jizya. Just a kind of clarifying another misunderstanding. I know I'm very much aware that Islam is one of the misunderstood religion in the world. So in Egypt, so we talked about Turkey and you just mentioned Egypt. So in Egypt, how did Christians end up how they are now Coptic?
How did they end up in what way?
Like this. So Egypt was a Christian country.
Oh,
I hear from Muslims, like every time when you need to kind of have a discussion of how Christians and Muslims, can they live together, or can Christians live in Muslim majority countries? Example of, look at Egypt. Today's Egypt is example how we live in a loving way. Of course, they forget the part like when they burn the churches, when they burn people. They forget that part, or beheaded people. They forget that part. But overall, Egypt, today's example is Egypt. In Middle Ages, of course, it is Spain. So what went wrong? How our understanding is changed?
Well, what went wrong in terms of our understanding is that people aren't taught the truth about history or about present-day reality. Egypt was 99% Christian when it was conquered, but then the Christians were subjugated as dhimmis, which means that they could not hold authority over Muslims, which means that if anybody wanted to have a good job that paid reasonably well, he had to convert to Islam, because the Christians could only get the most menial jobs that paid very little, that would ensure that they did not have authority over a Muslim. The Christians could not build new churches or repair old ones. And even today, there's still riots in Egypt if Christians are trying to build a new church. And Muslims say this is against Islamic law, and it is. Because the idea is that the Christian community must always be in a state of decline. It must always be on its way out. It must always be diminishing. That is part of Islamic law, so that Islam dominates always. And so the Christians over time, they lived with this discrimination, this humiliation. You're walking down the street, you have to step aside so the Muslim can pass. You can't build a building higher than an Islamic building. You can't hold a decent job. You have to pay this tax that the Muslims don't have to pay. Many people over the centuries, they converted. And so the Egyptian Christians that were, Egypt that was once 99% Christian is now 90% Muslim. Where did all the Christians go? They're still there. They're just converted to Islam over the years, but they did not convert to Islam because Islam is so wonderfully compelling. They did not convert to Islam because Islam teaches such beautiful things that they were brought over to the idea of its truth. They converted to Islam because it was so miserable to live under that Pact of Umar, so miserable to live as Christians, that most of them ultimately gave up.
So where is the origin of this? So when we look at the life of Muhammad or the life of caliphs, who is the one who gives us those details that today's Muslims feel they need to follow?
Well, it does come from Umar, who was the caliph from 634 to 644. And he supposedly, I mean, of course, none of this has any historical basis. It all comes from 9th century records. But supposedly in the 630s or 640s, he concluded a pact with the Christians wherein they accepted all this discrimination and humiliation, second-class status, and so on. And that this became the basis for Islamic law regarding how the non-Muslims were to be treated. And what's an interesting indication of the ignorance that people have today about the history of all this is that people say nowadays that Umar's pact was tolerant. Anybody who reads it can see that it's anything but tolerant. It's putting all manner of onerous restrictions on the Christians. How do you respond to Muslims saying jizya is less than zakat? This is so absurd, and they do repeat this because they know that we don't know the history. Well, I know the history. I wrote the history. I wrote the Quran, and I also wrote the history. And so the history is very clear that over time, the Christian populations in the Middle East, in Egypt, and also in Syria and all over North Africa, they disappeared or were substantially diminished because it was so difficult to live under the dhimma, under the discrimination that Islamic law mandated. Now, human nature being what it is, people like to live a life that is easier rather than harder if they have a choice, generally. And of course, there are great saints who they will take great hardship to serve God and so on. But for the most part, people will choose comfort and ease if they have a choice, if they have the ability to choose. And this is why there are no Egyptian Christians today, or so few Egyptian Christians today. Now, if zakat were less than jizya, we would have seen Muslims converting to Christianity throughout
so that they pay the jizya.
So they would pay the jizya, because people don't want to pay the money to the government. If I work all day, I earn money, I don't like having to give it to the government. I do it because I don't want to go to jail. But if you have a choice to pay a lesser tax, people will take that choice. And so people would have converted to Christianity. But we never see that anywhere ever in Islamic history. And that's because zakat was never anywhere in Islamic history less than jizya.
So, what is zakat for? What is jizya for? And why it will be, or would you say it will be wrong to identify jizya as tax? Like I hear sometimes Muslims compare when you talk about jizya, they say, well, you live here, don't you need to pay tax? It's the same thing. You live in Muslim countries, don't you pay jizya? So they compare, they make jizya like as a tax who comes and then collects my bill. How would you kind of define those three terms?
Certainly. Zakat is one of the pillars of Islam. The almsgiving that is generally set in most Islamic states today, and even majority Muslim countries that don't enforce Sharia, you have 2.5% of your income taken for zakat, which is obligatory almsgiving, charity that is given to the state or to an Islamic authority, and then it is distributed as they see fit. Even today in the United States, we have the Council on American Islamic Relations, and it assures Muslims giving to the Council on American Islamic Relations is zakat eligible, which means you can say, I paid my zakat if you give money to this organization. But you could also give it to any number of other things. It is given then for jihad and for other purposes, for the sake of the needy and so on. But we should emphasize that zakat can also be used and is also used for jihad. And this is why in the West, so many Islamic charities have been convicted of aiding terrorism, because they're giving zakat money to jihadis, as one would expect. The jizya is a tax that is specified in the Quran, chapter 9, verse 29, that the people of the book, the Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians, must pay in order to be allowed to live in the Islamic State. And so it's a tax that can be much higher. It generally is much higher than zakat, much higher than the 2.5%. In Egypt, in the 7th century, there are records of Muslims actually seizing the children of the Christians because they couldn't pay the huge jizya payment that had been set, and so they took their children instead. And this was something that was always at the whim of the Muslim ruler. If you didn't pay it, if you don't pay zakat, then you can be punished in an Islamic state. But rarely, if ever, is the punishment death, while the punishment is always death if you don't pay jizya as a subjugated person. And the jizya is a sign of your humiliation. It is collected according to Islamic law in an atmosphere of humiliation. Zamakhshari in the 13th century, an Islamic jurist, actually says that the jizya collectors should spit on the people paying when they pay it. Nobody ever spits on the people paying zakat when they pay it. To pay zakat is an honor. You're fulfilling your obligation before Allah. You are paying jizya. It's a sign of your subjugation and humiliation to the Muslims. And so you must be humiliated. If they don't spit on you, another jurist says that you have to be struck on the back of the neck at that time. And so the jizya is a point of shame, and is designed to be that, to remind the non-Muslim, you're a rebel, you're an enemy of Allah because you have rejected Islam, and you'll be punished in this world, and that's what the jizya is for, and then in the next world with hellfire.
So you would use the term tax for jizya, comparing like definition of the tax in today's society? Would you say like jizya is also like in today's, comparing today's, it is tax?
Well, it is a tax, but it's a tax that's more lethal than any tax that people pay in today's society. Because the tax that I pay as an American citizen and the tax that a British citizen might pay, these are for the support of various services that the government provides.
Yeah.
And so it's designed to be, at least theoretically, a cooperative arrangement that the government provides roads and highways and schools and so on. And in return, we fund all this by paying the tax. But for jizya, you're not buying anything. and you're not cooperating in anything. You are only
But still,
securing that you're not killed.
yeah, securing your head, like your head is still stick to your body.
Yeah, you're buying your head.
Yeah,
Yes.
or you are renting your head, because if you don't have the money, they take it from you.
Yes, and they can
Okay.
decide to take it anyway.
So you unpack the history of Egypt for us. You unpack the kind of reality of Ottomans. What about Golden Age? What about this beautiful Spain?
Yeah,
Christians and Jewish apparently were there so happy. That's the time where Muslims want to go back. What is the reality on that?
the reality is that's completely mythological. That none of the sources from the time that Muslims ruled Spain show anything like what we are told nowadays about the peaceful, tolerant society that was established by the Muslims in Spain, supposedly. Even Maria Rosa Menocal, who is a historian, actually, I don't know, she was a historian. I don't know if she's still alive, but she wrote a book not many years ago. Forgotten the name of it. I'm sorry, but it's
Myth in the myth of Andalusia.
yeah, it's something about Andalusia
Yeah.
being wonderful. But I don't remember the name of it. In any case, The Ornament of the World. That's it. The Ornament of the
Okay.
World. And it's supposedly a historical exposition of life in Andalusia and how wonderful it was for the Muslims and the Jews and Christians. But very early in the book, even she admits that the Jews and Christians did not exist in Andalusia except as dhimmis. And they had to pay the tax, they had to be submissive and accept the hegemony of the Muslims, otherwise they would be killed. Andalusia, as I show in the history of jihad, was also a center of the Islamic slave trade, because they would take the slaves from the non-Muslim population and send them into the Islamic lands. And this was nothing like the tolerance and peace that we are told. None of that really happened at all. But here again, people nowadays are capitalizing upon the ignorance of history that is so prevalent in the West. And so Westerners are being taught that Islam has this wonderful tradition and history of tolerance, while the history of the Western countries is all about racism and slavery. The biggest slavers in history were the Muslims, but it's all being obscured.
There is a comment from Mr. or Mrs. Muslim. I think he can't believe what you are saying, because he's saying, what is it wrong? What is it wrong? People who do not have the faith of Islam to pay jizya like as a sign of humiliation, while to the authorities, while Muslims has to pay zakat. So zakat and jizya is the same thing. You are disbeliever, it is labeled as jizya. You are believer, it is labeled as zakat. What is wrong?
It's not the same thing. As you noted just then, it's, you said it's a humiliation to pay the jizya. If people were slapped and spat upon when they paid zakat, then you might have a point. If zakat were at the same rate as the jizya, you might have a point. But none of that is true. And so I challenge anyone who's watching this to show any kind of genuine historical evidence that the jizya was ever less than zakat, or that zakat was ever paid with the kind of humiliating circumstances that were required for the payment of jizya.
So do we get to see examples of jizya at the time of Muhammad? I know your view. I'm talking about traditional Muhammad. I know your historical understanding of Muhammad is different than the tradition. So going with the tradition,
Yes.
do we have examples of jizya from the time of Muhammad?
Yes, certainly. He told his followers to collect it, and the Caliph Umar actually said, and Umar, of course, was a contemporary of Muhammad. He told his followers that the source of the Muslims' livelihood is the jizya. So be sure to collect it always from the Muslims. There are hadith in which Muhammad says that you should not harm the dhimmis, and these are very commonly quoted nowadays by Islamic apologists who say, see, you must not harm the dhimmis. They're wonderful protected people. But the idea is there that they are the source of the money that the Muslims have. And so obviously you don't kill the golden goose. You don't kill the people who are paying for your upkeep. And so it's not really an expression of tolerance that he says don't kill the dhimmis. It's a matter of the fact that the dhimmis were paying for
Your living.
the living of the Muslims. And this has been
Yeah.
true throughout history. The Ottoman Empire fell because the dhimmi populations had been impoverished. When the dhimmi populations were rich, the empire was prospering. But by the time the dhimmi populations had been exhausted, had been relieved of their money for the most part, the empire fell because there was no work ethic. There was no idea that you work in order to pay for your own upkeep. You get paid by the non-Muslims. When the non-Muslims can no longer pay for you, then everybody gets poorer.
And no one wants everyone to get poor, so therefore you get your jizyas.
Yes, and then you get more jihad to conquer more lands so that you can collect the jizya.
Yeah, money is important. Money buys lots of things in this world. Are there other surahs beside 929 shows us how lovely is Islam?
Why, the Quran is full of loveliness. It's throughout the book. You have all manner of things. I mean, I could go on and on about that.
Okay, just in case anyone doesn't get it, can you give us the word lovely with the Islamic definition? What is the lovely in Islam? In Islam?
The lovely in Islam?
Yeah.
I'm not
so
sure.
in reality, like lovely is good term, but in Islam,
yes,
definition of that word is a little bit different.
Well, you have chapter 98, verse 6, the unbelievers are the most vile of created beings. Chapter 8, verse 55, the unbelievers are like animals. Chapter 32, verse 13 is one of my particular favorites, where Allah says he could have guided everyone to the truth, but instead he decided to fill hell with jinns and men. And I think, what a monster, that he could have brought everyone to the truth. You know, in the New Testament we read, God desires all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. But Allah doesn't want all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. He wants to torture some of them in hell just because he could have brought everyone to the truth. And so the Quran is full of loveliness of that kind.
Yes. Keep away from that love. Please keep away from that love. So there is a comment. Islam took over 1 million slave girls from Europe between 1530 to 1780 alone. Slavery continues today in Islamic world. They didn't pay jizya. They were mainly sold into harems. And a couple of years ago, I was in Libya. In Libya, you've got open market where you pay $600 to buy a black man with 6 packs. So slavery still in Muslim majority countries taking place, even in Saudi and in Qatar, very much practiced. What are your thoughts how people were sold into harems?
That's certainly true. There's no doubt about that. There were slave raids all over Europe, all through the Middle Ages up until modern times. You don't believe me? Read White Gold by Giles Milton, or there are other books about it that are more recent. There were slave raids in England, slave raids in Ireland, even in Iceland and Sweden, Norway. The Muslims would come up from Morocco and Algeria and go to a coastal town in Europe and go often into the church during services, because then there would be a crowd of people, and take them and enslave them back in Morocco and Algeria. This is a black hole in history. People don't know what happened to these people because, of course, no records were kept. How many historians write about the slaves that some emperor had. You know, the Ottoman caliphs, and sultans, the various other Muslim rulers, including in Andalusia and elsewhere, they all had slaves, and many of them, if not most, were Christians taken from Europe. But then they're lost in history. We don't know they were killed. We don't know if they had children. If they had children, they were raised as Muslims, and so their existence is completely erased.
What is the Islamic reference for slavery? Because it is very easy for Christians or people who think critically to simply look at the Islamic worlds and then say he's the what Muslims are doing, because that might not be Islam. Islam is like this lovely, beautiful religion, gives lots of rights to everyone.
Yeah, that's what they say. But the thing about slavery, it's very interesting, the contrast between Christianity and Islam, in the sense that in the Bible and in the Quran, you have slavery taken for granted. And so Muslim apologists in the West like to say, you talk about slavery, but there's slavery all through the Old Testament. And even St. Paul says, slaves, obey your masters, and so on. So how can you say that Christianity is superior to Islam in this regard? And actually, here again, that argument relies on an ignorance of history and an ignorance of theology. Muslims love to come to Christians with their understanding of Christianity that's quite faulty. And they read the verses about slavery that are in the Bible, but they don't understand that in the Bible also you have the idea of the universal dignity of every human person as made in the image of God. And consequently, that was taken up by the abolitionists in England and then in the United States. There were no abolitionists in Arabia or Iran or elsewhere in the Islamic world. The difference is that in the Quran, there is no idea of the dignity of every human person as being made in the image of God. There is no concept of that in the Quran. The Quran says that Muhammad is the apostle of Allah, and those who follow him are ruthless to unbelievers and merciful to one another. So it's easy to justify slavery on that basis. You're being ruthless to the unbelievers, as Allah commanded. And there is no verse saying free the slaves. There are plenty of verses that take for granted that the slaves exist. So in Christianity, you have the development of the abolitionist movement out of the biblical idea of the dignity of the human person. In Islam, that never arose.
I believe that also kind of quick respond to the comment on the screen. I think someone is just waking up and hearing Islam promotes slavery. Christian scripture identifies a God who comes and rescues people from their slavery. When Israelites were slaves, God looks down, God concerned, God saw, God heard their cry, and therefore he came and rescued people from their slavery. So very different interpretation and very different understanding of that in Islam. And even in Islam, if my understanding is correct, that Muslims are going to get slaves for eternity too. Like it's not only this world, but even for eternity. In Islamic paradise, they will have slaves.
The virgins of paradise and the boys like pearls that are promised to the believers in paradise, what are they but slaves? And if a Muslim aspires to be a slave of Allah, Abdullah, then how can you say that slavery on earth is something that's to be rejected? It's actually the greatest thing to which a human being should aspire.
Yep. Kind of my last couple of questions, if that's okay. It's been almost an hour I have taken you here. So we get to see, when we look at the life of Muhammad, we get to see these wars where kind of we label that as jihad, or Muslims label that as jihad. We looked at the Ottoman Empire, we looked at the Egypt and Spain, and then we saw, there were wars, Muslims conquered. and then they are kind of setting up their life, coming alongside of other people and sharing life with them. Therefore, yeah, jihad needed to take place. Discrimination of Christian people or not Muslims needed to take place. So it was necessary. I heard that argument, no worries. What about 21st century? So wouldn't you say with 9/11, actually jihad finished because people saw the different ways of Islam, and now we get to see Islam as really, really religion of peace?
Unfortunately, 9/11 was a great victory for the jihadis, great encouragement for them. And they are encouraged all over the world because they see they can take on a great superpower. And they have cost the United States trillions of dollars and gotten the United States involved in these ridiculous adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they've done so much to weaken the Western world with 9/11. So there's more jihad now than ever, but it's relatively quiet in the West, and so most Westerners think, "Oh, that's all over. It's something from 20 years ago," and they don't realize that it will be back. I hope all is well, ladies and gentlemen. We will see what is happening. Anyway, yes. Let's see. I don't know if I can put the questions up, but I'll see if there are any questions. I'll read them out. I'm not seeing any. If you have any questions, why don't you ask? A little bit concerned here until we see Hatun return. In the meantime, pray for her situation there in Britain. Oh, there you are. Good. Everything all right? You've got no sound.
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself. Sorry, I did ask the question, wouldn't you say 9/11 stopped jihad because Islam became the religion of peace?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's not happening. Jihadis are more emboldened than ever around the world. I went through a bit of that while you were gone. I hope that all is well over there and that you will be safe and prosper.
Thank you. There is a question. So, since you are the author of the Quran, did you also translate the Quran to Spanish and Italian? Did you remember, as the author of Quran, there are people who live in Italy and Spain?
Well, as the author of the Quran, I should only speak Arabic, but in any case, the problem with translations is that there has to be a translator and a publisher. And if anybody has those two things, please contact me at director@jihadwatch.org. But without those two things, nothing can proceed. And so there are no translations at this point. I hope that there will be in the future.
Okay. St. John of Damascus is a source for early Islamic history.
Yes, a very interesting source. As a matter of fact, I discuss him in my book, Did Muhammad Exist? And St. John of Damascus is very interesting as a witness to the fact that the Quran was not collected at the time of Uthman, as Islamic tradition says. Islamic tradition holds that in the year 653, Uthman got together all the people who had memorized parts of the Quran and standardized the text, burned all the variants, and distributed the Quran, to the single Quran, to the Islamic provinces. That didn't happen, and we know it didn't happen in the first place because nobody quotes this book that now everybody had for another 40 years. That's one problem with the story. Another is that John of Damascus, 50 or 60 years after this, he quotes Quran, and he also quotes books that are not in the Quran.
Chapters, yeah.
Yes, and he quotes and he refers to chapters as if they're separate books. And so it doesn't seem as if the Quran was in the form that it is in today at the time of John of Damascus. There's no reason why he would have done that if it had been.
So if we read the John of Damascus, then we will find out his writings are going against traditional Islam.
Yes. Well, he shows that the traditional story about how Islam was formulated is not historically true.
There's another question. Where did the term religion of Islam is the religion of peace come from? Why do Western people fall into this term?
Islam is a religion of peace. Once everyone is killed or subjugated under the rule of Sharia, then there will be peace.
Okay, once everyone is being peacist,
Yes.
then Islam becomes religion of peace.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but actually, in terms of being a propaganda effort, it seems to have started in the 19th century. There's a book in English, in any case, in the 19th century. In the 1890s, I believe it was published in 1896, called Islam, the Religion of Peace. And so it starts around then. The British government, which is just incredibly evil all through history, I'm sorry, but it's true. The British government actually propagated this idea in the 19th century because they wanted to make common cause with the Ottomans. And they had to sell that to the British people who knew that the Ottomans had been waging jihad against Europe for centuries. So how could they ally with the Ottomans? And then the British explained, well, you see, Islam is really a religion of peace. And so it was actually self-serving infidels who first propagated that false idea.
Well, Islam is about to take over Britain. Even though only 12% of London is Muslim, but Islam is about to take off the Britain. I am sure that will wake British people and British government up, that they will get rid of that term. Do you know anything about Georgian history and 1,200 years of fight of Islam against these people?
I see by your name that you are Georgian, but I am no expert in Georgian history. There is a little bit in the history of jihad about the jihad in the Caucasus, but not specifically so much about Georgia. I know there's a great deal more that can be said. I had to make some choices when I wrote the book. I hope to be able to write a follow-up at some point and fill in more. And then there would be more about Georgia in that.
Okay. My last question is, so since Islam kind of is the source of violence, source of danger to humanity, and every time when we talk about Islam, like we kind of feel everyone is being discouraged because it's just like too much violence, causing too much terror in the hearts of non-Muslims. What will be the like in 21st century? What do you think will be the solution, or where do you think Islam is going?
Islam is at a crossroads because of the internet and the fact that we can have this conversation and it can reach, people can watch us in Iran or Saudi Arabia or Turkey. And it used to be if somebody was born in those areas and grew up, they would never hear a word contradicting anything Islamic. It would never be exposed to any argument showing that Islam was false. Now, the truth about the Quran, which many Muslims don't know because they don't read the Arabic, they just recite it without understanding what the words mean. The truth about the Quran is known, the truth about Muhammad is known, the history is becoming known, and these things are grave challenges to Islam. I think there's going to be a crisis of apostasy in the Islamic world. It's already starting, really, but it's underground because of the death penalty for apostasy. But as it continues, there's strength in numbers, and it will become more open.
So you are just telling me we are about to finish that. Yes, Islam is very dangerous, but if you choose to live Islam, there is a death penalty for you.
Well, of course.
That's not very encouraging, is it?
No, but it's like the Draw Muhammad contest. A few years back, there was a cartoonist, Molly Norris, and she drew some cartoons saying, "This day will be Everybody Draw Muhammad Day. And most people said she was Islamophobic and racist, and they ignored it. And then she got death threats and went into hiding, and she's never been heard from again. Terrible story, but she had a point. She was right. And if she had been listened to, the situation today would be different. Because she said, if everyone draws Muhammad, they can't kill everyone. And if there are huge numbers of people converting, they can't kill them all. And so at a certain point, there will be a tipping point, and they will not be able to keep up with all the apostasy if we continue to push and to tell the truth.
It's interesting. Today I was informed that British police arrested 21 years old gentleman who converted to Islam a couple of years ago. British-born, British someone who converted to Islam a couple of years ago. Apparently was planning to kill me at Speaker's Corner, and he got arrested. So that kind of just shows us, yes, people will be there to take other people down, or they won't like what you are saying. But the bottom line is, when everyone speaks about it, when everyone speaks against it, they can shut everyone down.
Mm-hmm.
So,
exactly. If there were 100,000 of you doing what you do, they wouldn't be able to kill everyone. And I pray God grant that you not be protected.
Unless our government converts, you never know.
Yeah, well, the government might. It's already
Our king.
than most people know, and I hope you get out of there soon.
No, it's all good here. Thank you so much for joining me, helping us to think through a little bit of jihad. And I already picked up people enjoy the session. People find it very helpful and educating. So thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us. And by God's grace, I'll see you at the bosom of the Father or in somewhere else. But thank you very much, everyone who joined us. By God's grace, we will see you at Speaker's Corner or at the bosom of the Father or another live stream, wherever comes first. God bless you all. Thank you very much.